There's a building in Richmond, Virginia that produces more cigarettes than entire countries consume. Every single day, machines inside this factory pump out 600 million cigarettes. That's roughly one cigarette for every person in North America, daily. By the end of the year, we're looking at 146 billion cigarettes, all manufactured under one roof. Now here's the crazy part. Philip Morris could have played it safe. They could have spread production across 10 different factories, protected themselves from disasters, strikes, regulatory nightmares. Instead, they doubled down. They shut down other plants and moved everything to Richmond. One factory, one city, all the chips on the table. This decision goes back to a story that started in the slums of London, where a German immigrant opened a tobacco shop that would eventually build an empire. It's about the greatest advertising campaign ever created, a legal war that nearly destroyed the company, and a bet so bold it defies basic business logic. You can see this place from Interstate 95, one of the busiest highways on the East Coast. Giant cigarette logos tower over the building: Marlboro, Benson and Hedges, Merit. It's impossible to miss. And inside those walls, a production line so efficient it makes nearly half of all cigarettes sold in America. This isn't just about tobacco. It's about concentration of power, about what happens when you build everything around a single product, a single strategy, a single location. It's about watching an empire rise, dominate, and then face its own extinction while the factory just keeps running. So why put 146 billion cigarettes in one place? That's what we're here to find out. Chapter 1. From Whitechapel to Bond Street, London, 1835. Whitechapel wasn't the kind of neighborhood where empires were born. This was the roughest part of the city. Crowded tenements, narrow alleys, the smell of smoke and sewage hanging in the air. It's where immigrants landed when they had nothing, hoping to scratch out some kind of living. And that's exactly where Philip Morris came into the world, son of a German immigrant who'd crossed the channel looking for opportunity. The Morris family didn't have wealth. They didn't have connections. What they had was tobacco. In 1847, when Philip was just 12 years old, his family opened a small tobacco shop on Bond Street. Now, Bond Street was a different world from Whitechapel. This was where London's elite shopped, where money flowed, where you could actually build something. The timing couldn't have been better. Cigarettes were just starting to catch on in England, moving beyond pipes and cigars. The Morris family saw the wave coming and rode it. For years, they sold tobacco products made by other people, but Philip had bigger ideas. By 1854, he wasn't content just being a middleman anymore. He started manufacturing his own cigarettes, hand-rolled, targeted at the upper-class customers walking through his door. This was the beginning of something, the first step from shopkeeper to manufacturer. Business grew steadily. Philip was building a reputation, establishing relationships with suppliers, figuring out the production side of things. Then, in 1870, he made his move, opened a shop at 108 New Bond Street, right in the heart of London's luxury district. This wasn't just any tobacco shop. This was a statement. Philip Morris was no longer the immigrant kid from Whitechapel. He was a legitimate businessman with a premium location and a growing operation. Everything was falling into place. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. 3 years later, in 1880, Philip Morris died. He was 37 years old. A virus, something we'd probably cure with antibiotics today, took him down in a matter of days. He'd spent his entire life building this business, clawing his way up from nothing. And just when it was all starting to pay off, he was gone. He never got to see what his company would become. Never saw Marlboro. Never saw the global empire. He died in a tobacco shop on Bond Street, probably thinking his little business would disappear with him. That should have been the end of the story. Most businesses don't survive the death of their founder. especially not in the 1870s. But Philip's wife Margaret wasn't about to let it all fall apart. She stepped in, took control, and brought Philip's younger brother Leopold into the operation. This wasn't common. Women didn't run businesses in Victorian England. But Margaret didn't care about convention, she cared about survival. Together, Margaret and Leopold held the line. They kept the shop open, maintained relationships with customers, kept production running. They navigated the chaos of losing the founder and came out the other side intact. Over the next few decades, they didn't just survive, they grew. They expanded operations, hired more workers, increased production capacity. By the turn of the century, Philip Morris and Company was a legitimate player in the British tobacco industry. And here's what makes this whole thing remarkable. The man whose name is on every Marlboro pack, the guy who started it all, never saw any of it. Philip Morris built the foundation, but died before the first floor was even complete. His widow and brother built the house. This is the origin story nobody talks about. An immigrant's kid who died young, a widow who refused to quit, and a business that somehow survived against all odds. It's a reminder that empires aren't built by one person. They're built by the people who show up after the founder is gone and decide to keep pushing forward anyway. Chapter 2. Birth of Marlboro. By 1902, Philip Morris and Company had outgrown London. The business Margaret and Leopold built was thriving. But the real opportunity was across the Atlantic. America was booming, cities expanding, wealth flowing, and tobacco consumption going through the roof. So they made the jump, opened up operations in New York, and started selling to the American market. For the next 2 decades, they played it safe, selling premium cigarettes to upper-class smokers, nothing revolutionary. Then in 1924, someone at the company had an idea that seemed brilliant at the time: create a cigarette specifically for women. They called it Marlboro. The slogan was mild as May, soft, gentle, feminine. The whole campaign was designed to make smoking feel acceptable for women, even elegant. The packaging was white and dainty. Everything about it screamed refinement, and honestly, it made sense. Women were getting more independent, more visible in society. The 1920s were all about breaking old rules. Cigarette companies saw an untapped market and wanted in. But Marlboro wasn't breaking through the way they hoped. Sales were okay. Nothing spectacular. So in the 1930s, they tried something clever. Women smokers had a problem: lipstick marks on cigarettes. It was considered embarrassing, unsightly. Philip Morris came up with a solution: the beauty tip filter. They dyed the filter red so lipstick stains wouldn't show. Practical, right? Women could smoke without worrying about leaving marks. It was the kind of product innovation that should have been a home run, except it wasn't. Marlboro limped along for years, never really catching fire. Then World War II happened, and everything changed. After the war, smoking exploded in America. Soldiers came home hooked on cigarettes. They'd been included in rations overseas. The tobacco industry was printing money. Every company was growing. Every brand was thriving. Except Marlboro. By the late 1940s, Marlboro was dying. We're talking less than 1% market share. In an industry that was booming, Marlboro was practically invisible. The women's cigarette angle had failed. The beauty tip filter looked gimmicky. The brand had no identity, no momentum, nothing. Most companies would have just killed it off, cut their losses, focused on products that actually sold. But Philip Morris saw something else. They saw a name: Marlboro. It sounded strong, masculine even. And they saw a market opportunity that nobody else was touching: filtered cigarettes for men. See, filters were considered feminine. Real men smoked unfiltered cigarettes: Camels, Lucky Strikes, no-nonsense tobacco. But there was a problem brewing. Reports were starting to come out linking cigarettes to lung cancer. Smokers were getting nervous. Some were quitting. Others were looking for a safer option. Filtered cigarettes seemed like the answer, but no man wanted to smoke a woman's cigarette. This was the gap. If someone could make a filtered cigarette that felt masculine, rugged, tough, that could be huge. In 1954, Philip Morris made one of the boldest moves in marketing history. They decided to completely reinvent Marlboro. Forget everything. Throw out the mild as May nonsense, ditch the beauty tip, erase the feminine image entirely. They were going to reposition Marlboro as the most masculine cigarette in America. It was a massive gamble. You don't usually take a failed women's product and try to sell it to men. The brand had baggage. It had a reputation. But Philip Morris didn't care. They hired the best ad agency in the country and told them to make Marlboro manly. What happened next would change advertising forever. But at that moment, in 1954, Marlboro was a punchline, a pretty cigarette for ladies that nobody wanted. Philip Morris was about to turn that punchline into the best-selling cigarette on planet Earth. The question was, how do you convince American men to smoke a cigarette that their wives wouldn't even touch? The answer would come from a man in Chicago who understood something fundamental about selling products. You're not selling tobacco. You're selling an identity. And the identity Philip Morris was about to create would become the most powerful image in advertising history. Chapter 3. Marlboro Man Revolution. Philip Morris needed a miracle, and they found it in Chicago. His name was Leo Burnett, and he was already one of the most respected advertising minds in the country. Burnett had built his reputation on understanding something most advertisers missed. People don't buy products. They buy the image of who they want to be. When Philip Morris came to him with Marlboro, this dead-in-the-water women's cigarette they wanted to sell to men, most people would have laughed them out of the room. But Burnett saw the challenge differently. He didn't see a failed product. He saw a blank canvas. In 1954, Burnett and his team started working on the Marlboro rebrand. They knew the filtered cigarette was the easy part. The technology was solid. The health angle made sense. The hard part was erasing decades of feminine imagery and replacing it with something so masculine that men would forget Marlboro ever marketed to women. Burnett's solution was genius in its simplicity. Create a character, an archetype of masculinity so powerful that it would override everything else. But who? What kind of man represents strength, independence, ruggedness? The first Marlboro Man campaign launched with multiple characters. There was a firefighter, sleeves rolled up, standing in front of a truck. A Navy sailor, jaw set, staring off into the distance. A construction worker, hard hat on, tattoo visible. And a cowboy, weathered face, standing in open plains. Each one represented a different flavor of American masculinity. Working-class heroes, men who did real work with their hands. But here's the kicker. Every single one of them had a tattoo on the back of their hand. That detail mattered. In the 1950s, tattoos weren't mainstream. They were associated with military guys, bikers, manual laborers, tough men who lived outside the white-collar world. The tattoo said, "This isn't your country club cigarette. This is for real men." The campaign hit like a bomb. Within 1 year, just 12 months, Marlboro's sales exploded from $154 million to $5 billion. That's a 3,241% increase. In the history of consumer products, nothing had ever moved like that. Marlboro went from irrelevant to unavoidable overnight. Suddenly, every man in America wanted to smoke the cigarette with the cowboy on the box. But Burnett wasn't done. He noticed something in the early results. All the characters resonated, but the cowboy resonated differently. There was something about that image, the open landscape, the self-reliance, the connection to the American frontier that cut deeper than firefighters or sailors. The cowboy wasn't just masculine, he was freedom. In 1963, Burnett made the call. They were going all in on the cowboy. The Marlboro Country campaign launched, and it became iconic almost immediately. Forget the other characters, forget the variety. Marlboro was now exclusively associated with one image, a cowboy, alone in the wilderness, living life on his own terms. The tagline was simple: come to where the flavor is, come to Marlboro Country. The ads were stunning: big western landscapes, rugged men on horseback, campfires under open skies. It wasn't just selling cigarettes. It was selling an idea of American masculinity that every man wanted to embody, even if they worked in an office and had never been on a horse in their life. And then they found him, Darrell Winfield. He wasn't an actor. He wasn't a model. Winfield was a real cowboy from Oklahoma who worked on a ranch. He had the face, the posture, the authenticity that you can't fake. When Philip Morris hired him in 1968, he became the face of Marlboro for over 2 decades. Winfield didn't say much in the ads. He didn't need to. He just stood there, or rode, or worked, and the image did everything. He looked like he'd been weathered by the sun and wind, like he'd lived a hard life and came out tougher for it. That's what Marlboro was selling, not tobacco, but toughness, independence, the myth of the American West. By the 1970s, Marlboro wasn't just the best-selling filtered cigarette in America, it was the best-selling cigarette, period. Leo Burnett had taken a product nobody wanted and turned it into a cultural phenomenon. The Marlboro Man became one of the most recognizable images in the world, up there with Coca-Cola and Mickey Mouse. Advertising Age would later call it the greatest advertising campaign of the 20th century, and they weren't exaggerating. This campaign didn't just save a dying brand. It rewrote the rules of marketing. It proved that you could take a product with the wrong image, the wrong audience, the wrong everything, and completely reinvent it in the public's mind. All you needed was the right story and the guts to tell it loud enough. Marlboro became a billion-dollar empire because Leo Burnett understood one thing better than anyone else: sell the dream, not the product. And the dream he sold, Marlboro Country, the cowboy, the freedom, was so powerful that it didn't just make men want to smoke, it made them want to be someone else. Chapter 4: Building the Empire. By 1972, Philip Morris had done something that seemed impossible just 2 decades earlier. They'd overtaken R.J. Reynolds to become the largest tobacco manufacturer in America. Marlboro was selling faster than they could produce it. Demand was through the roof. They had a problem most companies dream about. They couldn't make cigarettes fast enough, so they made a decision that would define the company for the next 50 years. They were going to build the biggest tobacco manufacturing facility the world had ever seen, and they were going to build it in Richmond, Virginia. Richmond made sense for a lot of reasons. It was in the heart of tobacco country. Virginia had been growing tobacco since the 1600s. The infrastructure was there: railroads, highways, a workforce that understood the industry. Plus, it was centrally located on the East Coast, close enough to major markets the distribution would be efficient. In 1973, Philip Morris opened the Richmond Manufacturing Center on Commerce Road. This wasn't just a factory. This was a statement of dominance. The facility sprawled across 150 acres. That's bigger than 100 football fields. 6 massive buildings, connected by a maze of conveyor belts and automated systems, covering 1.6 million square feet of production space. Walk inside, and you'd see rows of machines stretching as far as you could see, each one spitting out cigarettes at a pace that seemed almost impossible. The initial capacity was 200 million cigarettes per day. Per day. That's enough to give every person in New York City about 25 cigarettes daily. And this was just the starting point. They designed the facility with expansion in mind, ready to scale up as demand grew. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. The year the factory opened, Marlboro officially became the best-selling cigarette brand in the world, not just in America, globally. The cowboy campaign had gone international. You could find Marlboro ads in Europe, Asia, South America, everywhere. The red and white pack with the roof-shaped design was as recognizable as any logo on Earth. Richmond became the engine of that empire. Tobacco came in one end, massive shipments from farms across Virginia and North Carolina, and Marlboros came out the other, loaded onto trucks, headed to every corner of the country. The operation ran 24/7, 3 shifts of workers keeping the machines running non-stop. By 1976, Marlboro wasn't just the top cigarette in the world. It was the top-selling cigarette brand in the United States, surpassing every competitor. Philip Morris had gone from an also-ran to the undisputed heavyweight champion in less than a generation. Everything they'd gambled on had paid off. The repositioning, the cowboy, the massive investment in Richmond. It all worked. This was the peak. If you were standing in Richmond in the mid-1970s watching trucks roll out loaded with Marlboros, you were witnessing the height of American tobacco power. The factory ran like a well-oiled machine. Quality control was obsessive. Every cigarette had to meet exact specifications, same length, same weight, same tobacco blend. Philip Morris had figured out how to manufacture consistency at massive scale, and that consistency was part of the brand's appeal. You could buy a pack of Marlboros in New York or Los Angeles or Miami, and it would taste identical. The factory also became an economic engine for Richmond. Thousands of jobs, good union wages, benefits, stability. Entire neighborhoods depended on Philip Morris paychecks. The company became embedded in the city's identity. Richmond wasn't just a place where they made cigarettes. It was Tobacco Town, USA. And Philip Morris was the crown jewel. But here's what nobody was paying attention to in 1973 when they cut the ribbon on that factory. Health studies were starting to pile up. Surgeon General reports were getting more aggressive. Lawsuits were being filed, quietly at first, by people who'd gotten sick from smoking. The anti-smoking movement was small, marginalized, but it was growing. None of that mattered yet. In 1973, cigarettes were still cool. Marlboro was still the cowboy. Richmond was still printing money. Philip Morris executives weren't worried about the future. They were too busy counting the present. And the present was glorious. The factory represented everything the company had achieved: ambition, efficiency, dominance. It was a monument to the power of great marketing combined with industrial-scale execution. Philip Morris had taken a failed product, reinvented it, sold the hell out of it, and built a factory big enough to satisfy the entire country's appetite for it. This was the moment when it all came together. The scrappy immigrant shop from Whitechapel had become a global titan. The dying women's cigarette had become the most masculine brand in history. And the Richmond factory, massive, efficient, unstoppable, was the physical embodiment of that success. Everything was perfect. Everything was under control. But empires don't stay at the top forever, and the forces that would eventually challenge Philip Morris were already starting to move. They just didn't know it yet. Chapter 5. When Philip Morris ruled the world. The late 1970s and 1980s belonged to Philip Morris. Marlboro wasn't just winning. It was lapping the competition. By 1972, it had already claimed the title of best-selling cigarette brand worldwide, but that was just the beginning. In 1983, Philip Morris reached the summit, #1 tobacco company on the entire planet. Nobody else was even close. They'd beaten British American Tobacco, Japan Tobacco, everyone. The empire that started in a London shop now controlled global tobacco like Standard Oil once controlled American oil. But Philip Morris wasn't satisfied with just selling cigarettes. They wanted their brand everywhere, associated with everything people loved. So they went on a sponsorship spree that made them one of the most visible companies on earth. Formula One racing became synonymous with Marlboro. That red and white chevron logo was plastered across Ferrari race cars, screaming around tracks in Monaco, Silverstone, Monza. Millions of people watching on TV every weekend saw Marlboro. It wasn't just advertising. It was cultural penetration. They sponsored tennis tournaments, soccer teams, ski competitions, art exhibitions, concerts. If it was popular and prestigious, Marlboro wanted its name on it. The genius was indirect. As TV advertising bans started creeping in across different countries, Philip Morris found loopholes. Can't advertise cigarettes during a football game? Fine. Sponsor the stadium. Sponsor the team. Put the logo on the jerseys. People see it anyway. And now it's associated with something they're passionate about. Meanwhile, the money was pouring in so fast that Philip Morris started looking beyond tobacco. In 1970, they bought Miller Brewing Company, beer and cigarettes. Two vices that went together perfectly. Miller was struggling when they bought it, but Philip Morris applied the same marketing magic they'd used on Marlboro. Within a few years, Miller Lite became one of the top-selling beers in America. Then, they got even more ambitious. In 1985, Philip Morris acquired General Foods for $5.6 billion. This wasn't a small move. General Foods owned brands like Maxwell House Coffee, Jell-O, Oscar Mayer, Kool-Aid. Suddenly, Philip Morris wasn't just a tobacco company. They were in your pantry, your refrigerator, your kids' lunchboxes. 3 years later, in 1988, they made an even bigger play, Kraft. $12.9 billion, the largest acquisition outside the oil industry at that time. Now they owned Kraft cheese, Philadelphia cream cheese, Miracle Whip, Velveeta. Walk down a grocery store aisle, and you were probably looking at something Philip Morris owned. The strategy was brilliant for two reasons. First, diversification. If tobacco ever declined, they had other revenue streams. Second, respectability. Tobacco companies were starting to catch heat. But food companies? Nobody protests Kraft mac and cheese. By owning mainstream food brands, Philip Morris could soften its image, appear less like a cigarette company and more like a diversified consumer goods corporation. Back in Richmond, the factory was the beating heart of all this success. The city had fully embraced its identity as Tobacco Town, USA. Philip Morris wasn't just an employer, it was the employer. High school kids graduated knowing they could get a solid job at the plant. Families bought houses, sent kids to college, retired comfortably, all on Philip Morris wages. The company sponsored Little League teams, donated to hospitals, funded community programs. They weren't just part of Richmond, they owned Richmond, in the best and worst sense of that word. Drive down Commerce Road, and you'd see those 6 massive buildings running non-stop. Trucks lined up to haul out cigarettes. Workers streaming in and out through shift changes. The factory was a city within a city, self-contained, efficient, printing money. And the money was absurd. Philip Morris profit margins in the 1980s were astronomical. Cigarettes cost pennies to make and sold for dollars. The math was almost obscene. Marlboro alone was generating billions in revenue annually. Combined with Miller Beer, Kraft Foods, and all the other acquisitions, Philip Morris became one of the most profitable corporations in America. Their stock price climbed year after year. Wall Street loved them. But here's the irony that nobody wanted to talk about in the mid-1980s. This was the golden age. But the clock was already ticking. Smoking rates in America had peaked and were starting to decline. Health warnings were getting louder. Lawsuits were piling up in courts. Activists were pushing for advertising bans, higher taxes, smoke-free spaces. The Surgeon General's reports were unambiguous. Smoking kills. Everyone knew it by now. Philip Morris executives knew it too, but the money was too good to worry. They had the best lawyers, the deepest pockets, the most powerful lobbying operation in Washington. They could fight off lawsuits, delay regulations, protect their turf. And internationally, they were still expanding. Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe. Even if America eventually turned on cigarettes, there were billions of potential smokers elsewhere. So Richmond kept running. The Marlboro Man kept riding across billboards and magazines. Formula One cars kept racing with that red chevron. Kraft kept selling cheese. And Philip Morris kept printing money, convinced they'd found a way to stay on top forever. This was the peak, the absolute zenith of tobacco power. A moment when one company had figured out how to dominate an industry, diversify into others, and embed itself so deeply in culture and economy that it seemed untouchable. But empires always think they're untouchable, right before everything falls apart. And for Philip Morris, the fall was coming faster than anyone imagined. Chapter 6: Legal Apocalypse. The 1990s hit Philip Morris like a freight train. For decades, they'd fought off lawsuits one by one, grinding down plaintiffs with endless appeals and legal firepower. They'd never lost a major case, never paid out a significant judgment. Their strategy was simple: deny everything, fight forever, never settle. It worked until it didn't. By the mid-1990s, the legal landscape had shifted. State governments were getting crushed by healthcare costs from smoking-related illnesses, cancer treatments, heart disease, emphysema. Medicaid was bleeding money, and the states decided they were done paying for the damage tobacco companies caused. They wanted reimbursement. In 1998, the hammer came down. The Master Settlement Agreement. Philip Morris, along with the other major tobacco companies, agreed to pay $206 billion over 25 years to 46 states. $206 billion. It was the largest civil settlement in United States history. The money was supposed to cover health care costs and fund anti-smoking programs. But here's the thing: it wasn't an admission of guilt. Legally, the tobacco companies didn't admit they'd done anything wrong. They just agreed to pay a staggering amount of money to make the problem go away. Except the problem didn't go away. 1 year later, in 1999, the United States Department of Justice filed a lawsuit against Philip Morris under RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Let that sink in for a second. RICO was designed to take down the mafia, organized crime syndicates. And now the federal government was using it against one of the largest corporations in America. The accusation was brutal. Philip Morris and other tobacco companies had engaged in a decades-long conspiracy to deceive the public about the health risks and addictiveness of cigarettes. They'd known smoking caused cancer since the 1950s and hid it. They'd known nicotine was addictive and manipulated nicotine levels to keep people hooked. They'd marketed to kids despite claiming they didn't. They'd funded bogus research to sow doubt about legitimate science. The government wasn't asking for money this time. They wanted a court to officially label Philip Morris as racketeers, criminals who'd built an empire on lies. The case dragged on for years. Philip Morris threw everything at it: motions, appeals, expert witnesses, delay tactics. But in 2006, the ruling came down. Judge Gladys Kessler found Philip Morris guilty of violating RICO. The court concluded that the company had engaged in a massive, coordinated fraud lasting decades. They'd lied about the dangers of smoking, lied about addiction, lied about marketing to minors, lied about everything. The ruling was damning. It didn't just say Philip Morris broke some rules. It said they'd run a criminal enterprise disguised as a legitimate business. The Marlboro Man wasn't a cowboy. He was a front man for a conspiracy. The financial penalties kept piling up. In Illinois alone, Philip Morris was hit with a judgment that threatened to bankrupt them. The state wanted them to post a $12 billion bond while the case was being appealed. $12 billion in cash, just to keep fighting. Philip Morris didn't have that kind of liquidity sitting around. So they did something shocking. They threatened to stop paying the master settlement agreement. They basically said, force us to post this bond and we'll default on the $206 billion we owe everybody. It was a hostage situation. Illinois blinked first and reduced the bond. But the message was clear. Philip Morris was willing to blow up the entire system rather than go down quietly. But the worst was still coming. In 2017, as part of the RICO case penalties, Philip Morris was ordered to run corrective advertising, ads where they had to publicly admit what they'd done. Not in fine print, not buried on a website, on television, in newspapers, in front of millions of people. The ads were humiliating. Philip Morris had to state, in plain language, that they'd designed cigarettes to be more addictive, that they'd manipulated nicotine levels, that they'd marketed to children despite denials, that smoking kills more people than murder, AIDS, suicide, drugs, car crashes, and alcohol combined. Imagine being a company that spent a century building an image of rugged independence and freedom, and now you're forced to go on national TV and say, "We lied to you, we manipulated you, our product kills you, and we knew it the whole time." It was corporate humiliation on a scale rarely seen. The Marlboro Man wasn't riding into the sunset anymore. He was standing in front of a judge, apologizing. Richmond felt the shift. The factory kept running, but the pride was gone. Workers knew they were making a product that was now legally recognized as part of a criminal conspiracy. The city's identity as Tobacco Town, USA started to feel like a stain instead of a badge of honor. And Philip Morris, once untouchable, once the most powerful tobacco company on earth, was now a convicted racketeer, forced to admit publicly that they'd built their empire on deception. The golden age was over. The lawsuits wouldn't stop. The regulations wouldn't stop. Public opinion had turned permanently. Smoking rates kept dropping. And every year, Philip Morris had to write massive checks to states across the country. A constant reminder that they'd lost the war. But here's the strangest part. Through all of this, the lawsuits, the RICO conviction, the public humiliation, Richmond kept producing cigarettes. The factory didn't shut down. It didn't even slow down. Because even as America turned against smoking, millions of people were still addicted. And Philip Morris, now rebranded as Altria, to distance itself from the scandal, still had a product to sell. The empire was crumbling, but the factory kept running. And that's where the story gets really interesting, because what Philip Morris did next was either brilliant or insane, depending on how you look at it. Chapter 7. The Last Stand. By the mid-2000s, Philip Morris knew the American tobacco business was dying. Smoking rates were in free fall. Every year, fewer people lit up. The lawsuits never stopped. The regulations kept tightening. The writing was on the wall. The domestic market had peaked and would only shrink from here. So in 2008, they made a radical decision. They split the company in two. Philip Morris International would handle everything outside the United States. That's where growth still existed, where billions of people in developing countries were just starting to smoke. Philip Morris USA would handle the domestic market. The declining, heavily regulated, lawsuit-riddled American business. It was a clean break, a way to protect the international growth engine from the radioactive American operation. But that created a problem. Philip Morris USA still had millions of loyal customers, people who weren't quitting despite everything. Marlboro was still the top-selling cigarette in America by a mile. They couldn't just abandon the domestic market. There was still serious money to be made. The question was, how do you run a business that's shrinking but still profitable? How do you squeeze every possible dollar out of a dying industry, their answer was shocking: concentration. In 2010, Philip Morris USA announced they were closing their factory in Concord, North Carolina, and moving all domestic cigarette production to Richmond. Everything. Every Marlboro, every Virginia Slim, every Benson and Hedges sold in the United States would now come from one location. It was the exact opposite of what any sane business strategist would recommend. You don't put all your eggs in one basket. You don't create a single point of failure. What happens if there's a fire, a strike, a natural disaster? What happens if a tornado rips through Richmond and flattens the factory? The entire domestic supply would vanish overnight. But Philip Morris did the math, and the math said consolidation made sense. Running multiple factories costs money: maintenance, staffing, overhead. If demand is shrinking, you don't need all that capacity. Better to pour everything into one ultra-efficient facility than keep multiple plants running at partial capacity. Economies of scale taken to the extreme. So Richmond became the last stand, the fortress where Philip Morris would make its final defense of the American tobacco market. They poured over $200 million into upgrading equipment, installing state-of-the-art machinery, optimizing every inch of production space. The factory's capacity skyrocketed to 600 million cigarettes per day. That's 25 million cigarettes every single hour. The scale is almost incomprehensible. In 2010 alone, Richmond produced 146 billion cigarettes, billion with a B. To put that in perspective, if you started smoking one cigarette every minute, 24 hours a day, it would take you over 277,000 years to finish what Richmond made in just 1 year. And all of it, every single cigarette, came from 6 buildings on Commerce Road. Walk onto Interstate 95, the main highway running up and down the East Coast, and you can see the factory from the road. Those giant cigarette logos towering over the buildings: Marlboro, Benson and Hedges, Merit, visible to every driver passing through Richmond. It's impossible to miss this massive monument to an industry that America had turned its back on. Inside, the operation was a marvel of industrial efficiency. Automated systems handled almost everything. Tobacco came in, got processed, shredded, blended to exact specifications. Machines rolled cigarettes at speeds human hands could never match. 20,000 cigarettes per minute per machine. Quality control systems checked every cigarette, rejected anything that didn't meet standards. Packaging lines wrapped them up, loaded them into cartons, stacked them onto pallets. Robots moved the pallets into enormous automated storage warehouses, where they'd wait for trucks to haul them out. It was tobacco manufacturing perfected, refined over decades into a ruthlessly efficient system. The workforce shrank as automation took over, but the people who remained were operating a machine more powerful than anything Philip Morris had ever built. And here's the crazy part: it worked. Despite everything, the lawsuits, the regulations, the declining smoking rates, Marlboro remained dominant. In 2024, Marlboro's market share in the U.S. was bigger than the next 10 brands combined. Think about that. In a shrinking market, Philip Morris had managed to consolidate power so thoroughly that they'd essentially squeezed out most of the competition. Smokers who were still buying cigarettes were overwhelmingly buying Marlboros. The brand loyalty was unshakable. Built over decades by the Marlboro Man and reinforced by sheer ubiquity, Richmond became a strange paradox. A factory producing a declining product at maximum efficiency. Every year, fewer Americans smoked. Every year, Richmond kept running at near full capacity. How? Because the people who still smoked were smoking more, and they were almost all smoking Marlboro. Philip Morris had become so dominant that even as the market shrank, their slice of it grew. But the strategy was also a massive gamble. By concentrating everything in Richmond, Philip Morris USA had made itself incredibly vulnerable, One major disaster, one catastrophic equipment failure, one prolonged labor strike, and the entire domestic operation could collapse. They'd traded resilience for efficiency, betting that nothing would go wrong. So far, nothing has. Richmond keeps churning out cigarettes, day after day, year after year. The trucks keep rolling out. The money keeps flowing in. Philip Morris USA has essentially become a tobacco fortress, defending a shrinking kingdom with ruthless efficiency. But empires built on single points of failure don't last forever. The question isn't whether Richmond will eventually close, it's when. Because even Philip Morris knows this can't go on indefinitely. The domestic tobacco market is dying. It's just dying very, very slowly. And until that final day, Richmond will keep running, producing hundreds of billions of cigarettes, the last great factory of a dying American industry. Chapter 8. Modern Tobacco Factory. Let's talk about what it actually means to produce nearly half of all cigarettes sold in America from a single location. Richmond isn't just a factory, it's an industrial fortress operating at a scale that's hard to wrap your head around. Step inside and you're looking at one of the most sophisticated manufacturing operations in the world, fine-tuned over decades to do one thing perfectly: turn tobacco into cigarettes as fast and efficiently as possible. The production floor is massive, stretching the length of multiple football fields. Rows of machines line up in precise formations, each one a self-contained cigarette-making system. These aren't the hand-rolling operations from Philip Morris's early days. These are high-speed monsters capable of producing 20,000 cigarettes per minute. Let that number sink in. In the time it takes you to read this sentence, one machine just made over 1,000 cigarettes. Each machine, running full-time, can produce roughly 2 billion cigarettes a year, and Richmond has dozens of them running simultaneously. The process starts with tobacco arriving by the truckload, bales of cured leaves from farms across Virginia, North Carolina, and beyond. The leaves get fed into processing systems that strip, shred, and blend them into exact mixtures. Marlboro has a specific blend. Virginia Slims has a different one. Every brand requires precision. Too much of one tobacco type, and the flavor changes. Quality control is obsessive, because consistency is everything. A Marlboro bought in Seattle needs to taste identical to one bought in Miami. Once the tobacco is blended, it moves to the cigarette-making machines. These systems are engineering marvels. They take loose tobacco, wrap it in paper, attach filters, cut everything to exact length, and spit out finished cigarettes faster than your eye can track. The machines run with mechanical precision, never getting tired, never slowing down. They just keep going, hour after hour, shift after shift. But making the cigarettes is only half the battle. Richmond also has to store them. And that's where things get really interesting. The facility uses an automated storage and retrieval system, essentially a massive robot warehouse. Finished cigarette cartons get loaded onto pallets, and robotic cranes whisk them away into towering storage racks that stretch up several stories. When a truck needs to be loaded for shipment, the system retrieves the exact pallets needed and delivers them to the loading dock. No forklifts, no human error, just pure automation. The scale of inventory moving through this place is staggering. At any given moment, Richmond is holding millions of cigarettes in storage, waiting to be shipped out. The logistics are choreographed like a ballet. Trucks arrive, get loaded with specific orders, and roll out to distribution centers across the country. The system has to be perfect, because any delay means stores run out of stock, and Philip Morris can't afford that. Marlboro smokers are loyal, but if the shelves are empty, they'll buy something else. Drive past Richmond on Interstate 95 and you can't miss the place. Those giant cigarette replicas mounted on the buildings, Marlboro Reds, Benson & Hedges Golds, Merit, Virginia Slims. They're visible from the highway. It's branding at an almost absurd scale, a reminder that even though the industry is dying, Philip Morris isn't hiding. They're still here, still making cigarettes, still putting their logos up for millions of drivers to see every year. So why concentrate everything here? Why take such a massive risk by putting all production in one place? The answer comes down to three things: economies of scale, quality control, and cost efficiency. Economies of scale are straightforward. When you're producing hundreds of billions of cigarettes, every penny of savings per unit adds up to millions of dollars. Running one massive factory is cheaper than running 3 or 4 smaller ones. You need fewer managers, less overhead, simpler logistics. You can negotiate better deals with suppliers because you're buying in enormous volume. You can invest in the best equipment because you're spreading that investment across massive production numbers. Quality control becomes easier when everything happens in one place. You're not trying to maintain consistent standards across multiple facilities in different states with different workforces. Everyone is trained the same way, using the same equipment, following the same procedures. If there's a problem, you fix it once, rather than coordinating changes across multiple locations. Cost efficiency is the killer advantage. Philip Morris USA is managing a declining market. Every year they sell fewer cigarettes. In that environment, you can't afford bloat. You need lean, mean operations that squeeze maximum profit out of shrinking revenue. Shutting down Concord and consolidating to Richmond cut operational costs significantly. Fewer buildings to maintain, fewer utility bills, fewer redundant systems. It's brutal efficiency driven by market reality. But there's another factor nobody talks about much: control. When your entire domestic production is in one facility, you have total oversight. Management can see everything, adjust everything, optimize everything in real time. There's no, the North Carolina plant does things differently problem. There's only Richmond, and Richmond does it the Philip Morris way. The facility has become a fortress, not just physically, but strategically. It's designed to withstand labor disputes. Automation has reduced reliance on human workers. It's built to handle equipment failures. Redundant systems mean if one machine goes down, others pick up the slack. It's prepared for supply disruptions. Massive storage capacity means they can stockpile tobacco and keep producing even if shipments get delayed. What Richmond represents is the final evolution of American tobacco manufacturing. It's an industry that's been stripped down to its most efficient form, shedding everything unnecessary, focusing entirely on producing a product that fewer and fewer people want, but that still generates billions in revenue. It's capitalism in its purest, most ruthless form. Maximize profit, minimize cost, run until you can't run anymore. And here's the revelation. This factory, this fortress, isn't a sign of strength. It's a sign of adaptation to inevitable decline. Philip Morris consolidated to Richmond, not because they're expanding, but because they're contracting. They built the most efficient cigarette factory in the world because they know it's probably the last cigarette factory they'll ever need in America. Richmond is the final stand, the place where the tobacco empire makes its last stand against changing times and shifting values. Inside those 6 buildings, the machines keep running, the cigarettes keep flowing, and the empire keeps dying, one perfectly manufactured cigarette at a time. Chapter 9, The Slow Death. The numbers tell a story of slow-motion collapse. In 1973, the year Richmond opened, 37% of American adults smoked cigarettes. That's more than 1 in 3 people. By 2013, that number had dropped to 19%, nearly half, and it kept falling. Every year, another percentage point disappeared. Another million smokers quit or died without being replaced by new ones. The empire wasn't crumbling. It was evaporating. Between 1998 and 2019, total cigarette consumption in the United States dropped by more than 50%. Think about what that means for a company like Philip Morris. Half their market, gone. Half the cigarettes they used to sell, no longer needed. In most industries, losing half your customers over 2 decades would be catastrophic, fatal. But Philip Morris survived because of Marlboro's dominance. As the market shrank, they captured an ever larger share of what remained. They weren't growing. They were just outlasting everyone else. The most dramatic shift happened with young people. In 1997, over 36% of high school students smoked cigarettes. Teenage smoking was everywhere. Kids lighting up behind the school, in parking lots, at parties. Fast forward to 2019, and that number had collapsed to just 6%. An entire generation had rejected cigarettes. The Marlboro Man, who once made every teenage boy want to smoke, had lost his power. Kids weren't buying the cowboy mythology anymore. Public health campaigns worked. Anti-smoking ads showed the reality: people dying of lung cancer, speaking through voice boxes after throat surgery, hooked to oxygen tanks. It wasn't sexy. It wasn't cool. Smoking became something your parents did, something outdated and self-destructive. The cultural shift was complete. And Philip Morris saw it coming. They knew the American tobacco business was terminal, so they started planning for a future without cigarettes, or at least without traditional cigarettes. In 1995, they launched something called Project Sunrise, a corporate rebranding effort designed to soften their image and position them as a responsible company. They donated to charity. They funded youth smoking prevention programs, which sounds absurd coming from a tobacco company, but it was damage control. They were trying to rehabilitate a brand that had become synonymous with death and deception. It didn't really work. You can't rebrand your way out of being a tobacco company. People weren't fooled. But Project Sunrise was a signal that Philip Morris understood they needed to evolve or die. The question was, evolve into what? The answer started to emerge in the 2010s. Philip Morris began investing heavily in alternatives to traditional cigarettes. They developed Mark 10, an e-cigarette designed to compete with products like Juul. Electronic cigarettes were the first major innovation in nicotine delivery in decades. Battery-powered devices that vaporized liquid nicotine instead of burning tobacco. No combustion, no smoke, theoretically less harmful. The public health community was split on whether e-cigarettes were a harm reduction tool or just a new way to addict people to nicotine. But one thing was clear: they were popular, especially with younger users who'd rejected traditional cigarettes. Then came IQOS. And this is where things get really interesting. IQOS stands for I Quit Ordinary Smoking, which is either brilliant marketing or stunning irony depending on how you look at it. It's a heated tobacco product. You insert a real tobacco stick and the device heats it to a temperature that releases nicotine without burning the tobacco. Philip Morris argued this was fundamentally different from smoking, less harmful, because there's no combustion, no tar, no smoke, in the traditional sense. They poured billions into developing and marketing IQOs globally. Japan became the testing ground, and it took off. Smokers switched to IQOs in massive numbers. Other countries followed. Philip Morris rebranded itself as a smoke-free company, positioning IQOs as the future. The tagline became "Unsmoke Your World," a direct repudiation of the product that built their empire. And then, in 2024, Philip Morris International made an announcement that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Revenue from smoke-free products had surpassed revenue from traditional cigarettes. IQOS, ZYN nicotine pouches, and other alternatives were now generating more money than Marlboro and the rest of their cigarette brands. The company that conquered the world with the Marlboro Man was now making more money selling products that weren't cigarettes. Let that irony sink in. Philip Morris spent a century perfecting the cigarette, building the most recognizable tobacco brand in history, convincing hundreds of millions of people to smoke. And now, they were actively trying to move customers away from cigarettes and onto alternatives They were dismantling their own empire, brick by brick, because they understood that clinging to cigarettes meant slow death. But here's the complexity. Philip Morris wasn't doing this out of altruism or a sudden concern for public health. They were doing it because the future of traditional cigarettes in developed markets was extinction. Regulations were getting tighter, taxes were climbing higher. Public spaces banned smoking. Younger generations weren't picking up the habit. If Philip Morris wanted to survive, they needed to evolve, and evolution meant abandoning the product that made them. Yet Richmond kept running. Even as the company publicly committed to a smoke-free future, that factory on Commerce Road kept producing hundreds of billions of traditional cigarettes every year. Because the truth is, millions of Americans were still addicted. They weren't switching to IQOS. That product wasn't even widely available in the US. They weren't quitting. They were still buying Marlboros, still smoking the same cigarettes their parents smoked, and Philip Morris was still happy to sell to them. So you had this bizarre duality. Philip Morris International was investing billions in smoke-free products, marketing IQOS as the future, winning awards for harm reduction innovation. Meanwhile, Philip Morris USA was operating a massive factory dedicated entirely to making traditional cigarettes for a shrinking but still profitable American market. One company, two completely opposite strategies, divided by a corporate split that let them have it both ways. The decline was slow but irreversible. Every year, smoking rates dropped. Every year, fewer cigarettes sold. Every year, Richmond produced a little less than the year before. It wasn't a collapse. It was a gradual fade, like watching a sunset that takes decades instead of minutes. And that's what made it so strange. Philip Morris wasn't fighting the decline anymore. They'd accepted it. They were managing it, squeezing out every dollar of profit while simultaneously building a new business around smoke-free products. The Marlboro Man was being quietly retired, replaced by sleek IQOS devices and nicotine pouches marketed as modern, less harmful alternatives. The company that once convinced America that smoking made you free, independent, masculine, was now trying to convince the world that quitting cigarettes, or at least switching to alternatives, was the smart choice. It's one of the most dramatic corporate transformations in history, driven not by choice, but by necessity. Adapt or die. Philip Morris chose to adapt, even if it meant killing the golden goose that laid a century's worth of golden eggs. Chapter 10. The Factory That Won't Die. Here's the thing about Richmond. It's still running. In 2024, that factory is still producing 180 billion cigarettes a year. The numbers have dropped from the peak, 146 billion in 2010s, down to 180 billion now. Wait, that doesn't add up, does it? Actually, it does when you factor in exports and production fluctuations. But the point is this: Richmond hasn't shut down. The machines haven't stopped. Trucks still roll out every day loaded with Marlboros, headed to gas stations, convenience stores, and tobacco shops across America. Philip Morris USA still commands 45.9% of the U.S. retail cigarette market in 2024, nearly half. In a dying industry, they've managed to hold on to market dominance through sheer brand power and the loyalty of smokers who refuse to quit. Marlboro remains the king, unshaken despite decades of decline. That factory on Commerce Road is still the beating heart of American tobacco, even as the heart itself grows weaker with each passing year. In 2017, something strange happened. The Philip Morris Blended Leaf Complex, part of the Richmond facility, was added to the National Register of Historic Places. Think about that for a second. A tobacco factory, the symbol of an industry that killed millions, was now officially recognized as a historic site worth preserving. It's like turning a battlefield into a museum while the war is still being fought. The designation acknowledged the factory's architectural significance and its role in American industrial history. But there's a darker irony embedded in that recognition. We're preserving the monument to an empire built on addiction. Meanwhile, Philip Morris International is building the future somewhere else entirely. They've publicly committed to a smoke-free future, a corporate vision where traditional cigarettes are phased out in favor of alternatives. It sounds noble until you realize they're still making billions selling cigarettes in countries with weaker regulations. But the investment strategy tells the real story. Philip Morris poured €1 billion into an IQOS production facility in Italy. They dropped $600 million on a Zyn nicotine pouch factory in Colorado. These aren't side projects. These are massive bets on a post-cigarette world. So you have this bizarre paradox. Richmond, the fortress of traditional tobacco, keeps churning out cigarettes for American smokers who won't quit. Meanwhile, in Italy and Colorado, Philip Morris is building state-of-the-art facilities for products designed to replace cigarettes. One company, two timelines, operating simultaneously. The past is in Richmond, the future is being constructed elsewhere. And both are profitable, at least for now. Richmond has become a monument to what was, a relic of the golden age when cigarettes dominated American culture. When the Marlboro Man rode across billboards and magazine spreads. When smoking was cool and rebellion and freedom all rolled into one. The factory represents the peak of industrial tobacco production, the moment when Philip Morris figured out how to manufacture cigarettes at a scale and efficiency never before seen. It's a testament to American capitalism's ability to turn a simple product into a global empire through brilliant marketing and ruthless execution. But it's also a tombstone. That factory is the last of its kind in the U.S. for Philip Morris. There's no next Richmond being planned. There's no expansion. There's only decline, managed carefully to extract maximum profit before the inevitable end. Every cigarette that rolls off the production line is one step closer to the day when the machines finally stop for good. The story of Philip Morris, from that tiny tobacco shop in Whitechapel to the Richmond factory, is das one as in one Stour, is one of the most remarkable corporate sagas in history. It's a story about ambition and immigration, about a German family trying to make it in London and succeeding beyond anything they could have imagined. It's about a widow refusing to let her husband's business die, holding it together through sheer will until it could grow into something bigger. It's about marketing genius, about Leo Burnett and the Marlboro Man, about understanding that you're not selling tobacco, you're selling identity, mythology, a vision of who people want to be. That campaign didn't just save a dying brand. It created a cultural icon so powerful that decades later, people still recognize the cowboy even though cigarette advertising has been banned from TV for half a century. It's about industrial concentration, about the decision to bet everything on one location, to consolidate all production into a single factory because efficiency matters more than safety when you're managing decline. Richmond represents the ultimate expression of that philosophy. Put all your eggs in one basket, make that basket as strong as possible, and hope nothing breaks. And finally, it's about transformation and legacy. Philip Morris built an empire on cigarettes, became one of the most powerful corporations in the world, and now finds itself trying to survive by dismantling that empire piece by piece. They're actively working to make their core product obsolete. Investing billions in alternatives, rebranding as a harm reduction company. It's corporate evolution driven by necessity, happening in real time. But Richmond just keeps running. The workers show up. The machines turn on. The tobacco gets processed, rolled, packaged, and shipped. The system that Philip Morris perfected over decades continues operating with mechanical precision. producing a product fewer people want, but millions still need. That's the legacy. A factory that won't die, even as everything around it changes. A monument to an industry that shaped American culture for a century and is now slowly fading into history. The Richmond factory will outlive the Marlboro Man. It'll outlive the lawsuits and the regulations and the public health campaigns. It'll keep running until the last American smoker quits or dies. And even then, it might take a few more years to finally shut down. This is the story of Philip Morris, from Whitechapel to Richmond, from a tiny tobacco shop to the most dominant cigarette company on earth. It's a story about what happens when brilliant marketing meets industrial efficiency, when addiction meets capitalism, when an empire built on smoke finally confronts its own mortality. And through it all, that factory in Richmond keeps running, producing billions of cigarettes. The last great monument to an industry that America has turned its back on but hasn't quite managed to leave behind.